Okay, hello everybody. This is Mr. Schlissel, and we're going to try this lecture today for homework rather than listening to me in class. And I want to talk about something called the cell theory. And we'll see the cell theory is a way of explaining cellular life and how life exists really on the cell level. Humans are made up of trillions of cells, and that's because all your cells are performing all kinds of functions and keeping you alive. So even though you're a complex organism, you're really made of cells, and cells are the basic unit of life, and that's what the cell theory tries to explain. To understand it, we have to talk a little bit about the scientists who discovered that incredible tool that we're learning about now, the microscope. And let's talk briefly about Robert Hooke. And Robert Hooke was way back in the 1600s, over 400 years ago, and we credit him with inventing the compound microscope. Now, our microscope today looks very different than this, but this actually is the first compound microscope, and I believe it's in a museum in England. We also credit Robert Hooke with coming up with the name cells. We all use that today very much in class. And the reason why he used this name, he was observing with his compound microscope basically dead wood. And they looked like little rectangular shapes under his microscope. At the time, monks lived in rooms that were sort of rectangular in shape. Kind of think of a college dorm room, very small rooms, minus all the cool stuff that's in a college dorm room. And so since it reminded him of those rooms the monks lived in, and they were called cells at the time, he said, well, these structures, I will just give the name cells, and it sort of stuck. And Robert Hooke is credited with coming up with the first microscope and credited with the name cells. Around the same time, there's a German scientist who says, hey, I don't have to go out and buy Robert Hooke's microscope and spend money. I'm a glass maker and I can make my own magnifying sort of device. And his name was Anton van Leeuwenhoek. And he's also in Holland about the same time as Robert Hooke. And he invents the simple microscope, which is really a handheld magnifying glass. And here's the little tip. And at the time, people didn't really brush their teeth very well. And he would take some saliva from his mouth, and he'd put it on the tip right here where my cursor is, and then he would look at it. He'd put his eye over here on the other side, and he'd view it, and here was the lens right in this area right over here, and so he'd be able to see it magnified, and he would see all these little sort of animalcules, he called them, or beasties. And here's some pictures of what he saw. He was really looking at bacteria. And when he took some pond water, he was looking at some one-celled organisms. But in any event, he's also credited with, our discovery of the microscopic world with his invention of the magnifying glass, essentially. So we got Hooke, and we have van Leeuwenhoek. And we also now move 200 years into 1833. And here's a scientist named Robert Brown, and he discovers this structure right here, this number 1 here. And he says, every plant cell I look at has this structure, this large round body. And microscopes are improving, so he's able to see inside them. And as you might guess, that's the nucleus. Today we take it for granted, but remember at the time, the microscope was like the smartphone of today. Very, very cool thing to have. You're able to see things that were never visible before. And here we are, scientists discovering the nucleus, or at least saying that each cell has this large round body. We'll move forward a little bit more. And then 5 years into the future, a scientist, a botanist, botanist studies plants only. He looks at all of his plant samples, and he comes out with this profound statement, hey, all plants are made of cells. Hey, we know that today, but at the time, it must have been pretty amazing news. At the same time, or a year later, there's a zoologist. Yep, His name is Theodor Schwann in Germany. And Theodor Schwann, he studies animals, not much into plants like his friend Schleiden. And basically, he looks at all his samples, his tissue samples, and he says, hey, you know what? All animals are made of cells. So now we have sort of this discovery on a microscopic level that animals and plants are all made of these microscopic things called cells. And about the same time, a little bit maybe in the future, 1855, there is a physician. He studies disease and illness. And at the time, scientists, there was an argument about really how life came to be. Could you make a cell? Could you create it in a laboratory? And Virchow does some studying with his microscopes and basically comes out with his profound statement: every cell can only originate from another cell by cell division. And so he sort of puts to rest about how cells come into existence by dividing. That's what he saw under his microscope. And so together, the last three scientists, Schleiden and Schwann and Virchow, together they sort of form what we call our modern day cell theory. The first statement of the cell theory is all living things, all living organisms are made of cells. We know that to be true today. If you're alive, you're made of cells. The second statement, all cells carry on their own life functions. Think back to life functions like excretion, synthesis, hydrolysis. Every cell does these chemical reactions, and that's how the organism stays alive. If the cell doesn't do that, then the cell will die and the organism could die. And the last statement that makes up the third part of the cell theory is what we say: all cells arrive from other living cells by cell division. And there is Virchow, Dr. Virchow, who discovered that under his microscope. So this is what biologists use today to show that life is on a cellular level, and all these facts are true today. But it took years and years of discovery through improvements in the microscopes to be able to detect all these little scientific discoveries and finally come to this important cell theory. Now, I just want to mention a couple exceptions to the cell theory. One exception would be, well, Mr. Schlissel, if all cells arise from other living cells by cell division, one question could be, hey, where did the first cell come from? And so the cell theory can't explain that, but when we get to evolution, science can sort of explain maybe how the first cell evolved, and we'll get to that, but the cell theory can't explain it. And the other thing is these tricky little things. These things are viruses, and viruses are not living things, but they do have DNA inside them and maybe RNA. And here is the virus right over here that is responsible for HIV. It's the HIV virus. This might be this is called a bacteriophage virus. They infect bacteria, and I don't even know what kind of virus this is, but they're weird looking things in any event. And they're sort of exceptions to the cell theories because they're not cells, but they do have DNA inside them, and they can replicate and divide like cells, but they only can divide once they're inside a cell. You can have them in a bottle or in a test tube on your laboratory bench, and they'll never divide. But if you supply them with a cell, and they can then infect the cell and inject their DNA into the cell, and then they sort of divide. And so there are exceptions to the theory. And where did the first cell come from? They're also sort of a question that the cell theory cannot answer. Now, the other thing I want to talk about with our improvement in microscopes, today we know there are basically two types of cells. We see that on the left here is probably the one you're more familiar with. These are called the eukaryotes or eukaryotic cells, and these are prokaryotic cells. And these you may not be so familiar with, but I'm sure somehow they've had an influence on your life. Now we can see that the prokaryotes are very simple cells, and these eukaryotes are much more complex. And let's just discuss them for a minute. And these are really the two cell types we find today on the planet Earth. So a prokaryotic cell, well, they're the first cells ever discovered, and they're about 3.5 billion years ago. The first prokaryotes came into being. And they are primitive cells. If we look at them again, they have no nucleus. The red stringy stuff is representing the DNA, but they have none of the organelles that we see in the other more common cells, right? The mitochondria and the nucleus and the Golgi bodies, well, they're missing all that, the prokaryotic cells. And so they are very, very simple cells. Does not contain a nucleus. DNA is just floating around the cytoplasm. Let's get this one out of the way. Most of them may have a cell wall. Bacteria have a cell wall, and so they usually get protected from damage that way. And the last thing is, let's move this out of the way. Whoop. Let's get that out of the way here. Let's move it down. There's no organelles in these cells except ribosomes. They're very, very primitive type of cells, but very good and very adaptable because they've been around for 3.5 billion years ago. And a good example of some of these bacterial cells are like E. coli. And E. coli you might have heard of. E. coli live in our gut, and sometimes they make us sick as well. But E. coli are a prokaryote kind of cell structure. Very simple, no nucleus. And then you have the more common type of cells that we're familiar with, and they evolved about 2.5 billion years ago. They're called eukaryotes, and they are with a nucleus. Not only do they have a nucleus, but they contain many, many different organelles, which I'm sure some of them you're familiar with, and they have special jobs. And these are like animal cells and plant cells, fungi like mushrooms, and some protists like amoeba and paramecium. And so you got the primitive cells, and you got the ones that we're more sort of comfortable or understand more since we've been studying science in middle school, which are the eukaryotic cells. So those are the two cell types, and these all cells have come about from hundreds and hundreds of years of studying. And the last thing I want you to do for tomorrow's homework is to write down these questions, okay? Go back to the video, replay it if you have to, and also fill in your notes sheet that I gave you. And tomorrow, bring in your note sheet and bring in the questions on a separate sheet of paper with the answers, and we'll discuss them all together. So I hope this was helpful, and you can replay it anytime you feel you need to, and you can learn more about the cell theory. Okay, see you tomorrow.